So good afternoon, everybody. If you can join us with your video, I would appreciate it because like that I can see the faces and it's easier for me uh, to teach when there is some interaction. If that is too heavy on your internet, then just leave it. But ideally, you should be able to use your microphone. So let's start for today. Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, Denise. Um, we today we will be discussing the history of the Trans-Eurasian debate. So last time uh, we did an introduction to the course, and today we move to the debate on the origins of Japanese. Note that I have added one more session. So that is because we are a relatively small group. So last year we had 35 students and now there are about 20 students. And that means that in the end, we need less time for the presentations. So I squeezed in one more course today, the debate on the origins of Japanese. I noticed that teaching over the internet takes me a bit more time, especially when I try to let other people participate. It needs some time to connect. So today the debate, and then on next time we will discuss the different languages under discussion. So Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic languages. And on the 4th of December, we will have this more methodologically oriented session on how to establish language relatedness. And then we move to the comparative evidence for Japanese, and later we will discuss Japanese as a Trans-Eurasian structural type. On the 8th of January, we will have an interdisciplinary perspective when Mark Hudson, our archaeologist, and Ning Chao are going to join us, and they will give their perspectives on the peopling of Japan. And then we will have one more theoretical session on inferences about the Japanese past, integrating language, culture, and genes. And then we will have 4 sessions with student presentations. I think we are able to have 5 to 6 presentations in one session, so that should do. It's nice to see you all. At least I see to whom I'm talking now, so that's already a relief for me. Thank you. Um, so just to remind you, this is also what we said last time. There's a course website, and that course website has a password, namely Eurasia Triangle, which is the name of our team. And there you can find the readings for this course and some practical information. I also uploaded last time's slides in the schedule, so you will now see that in the schedule the first class is underlined, and you can download the presentation. I will do that also for the next times. The thing is with uploading presentations that I'm restricted to a limited size, so I cannot upload the maps or the pictures. What I can do, however, is record our session as such. I have been doing that, and I would like to make it public for you, but also for other people, so that other students elsewhere who are now not able to move due to Corona can have a look at the seminar. But for that, I will need your permission, in the sense that if you give me permission to include you, you will be included. Once in a while, we will edit the video, but once in a while, your answer will be included. If you don't give me permission, then I will cut you each time you answer, and also blur your face. Or in any case, we will not see faces; all faces will be blurred. So. The privacy statement is on our website, so you can just download it there, fill it in. Either you agree or you don't agree, just do as you please and send the privacy statement to me. It would be nice if you could do that by next week, so by 26 November. I also need your email address, but if you send me an email, I will have that. And then last time you gave me a short self-introduction. It would be nice if you could write down that self-introduction in just a couple of sentences, and if you could add a picture. In that way, I know who is who. And you send me all that by way of actieve teilnahme by 26 November, that is next week, Thursday. So here I have included how the consent form looks like. So you fill in your name and then you say either that you give me permission to upload our course video, including your image, or that you don't. So now I would like to move from the more practical issues back to the class with a small recap of what we did last time. Last time we were saying that Japanese is a real champion in historical comparative linguistics. Elias, do you remember in what sense Japanese is a champion?
It's a champion in that there are a lot of different language families and Sprachbunde that Japanese has been compared to, where we're not really sure where it's from or what other languages it might be related to, languages that are still alive or extinct. So it's special in that way, where we just have so many options, some that are more or less plausible, but we just don't really know.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Denise, do you have an idea of, or can you name us some of the language families Japanese has already been compared with in the past?
I think Mongolic. So the Altaic macro family, Turkic, Mongolic, I think Manchu Tungusic,
Yes.
Korean possibly, Austronesian, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, indeed. And then there were even more exotic families like Dravidian or, well, Sino-Tibetan is not really an exotic family, but it's maybe a bit of an exotic choice. And other families, also Ainu and so on. Does somebody know actually this Denise more or less said that already, but can you give me the 5 branches that make up the Trans-Eurasian family? Charlene, can you do that?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Yes, perfect. I think she already mentioned most of them: Turkic, Mongolic, Manchu, Tungusic, Japanese, and Korean.
Exactly. That's the 5 Trans-Eurasian branches. And yeah, indeed, here we see this map of Trans-Eurasian languages, which we also saw last time. Last time we were also discussing the idea in Japan that Japanese is a language isolate. Do you remember what a language isolate is? Is it A, B, or C? Is it a language that expresses relationships between words in a sentence by way of helper words? Is it a language without living relatives among the languages of the world? Or is it a language spoken in a geographically isolated area, such as in mountainous areas? I will start a poll. Okay, and I will publish the poll results. It looks as if most people have paid attention very well last time, so everybody or almost everybody answers B. And that's indeed the case. An isolate language is a language without living relatives among the other languages of the world. And the language A, the other option, it's a bit tricky, but that is called an isolating language or an analytic language, as opposed to a synthetic language, which is a language that uses that changes the form of words and uses bound morphology. Some more recap. The former name of the Trans-Eurasian language family. Joshua Ziegler, can you give me that?
That would be Altaic.
Exactly. And then Julia, can you tell us why we proposed a name change? Your mic is not, yeah, okay.
Sorry. I think because Altaic would suggest that there was indeed a common ancestor language, like a Proto-Altaic. That's debatable. So
yes, indeed, it's partly because of this hot debate and this polarization of the debate between anti and pro-Altaicists. Do you have other reasons? Not for the moment.
no, sorry.
Okay, then Damaris, can you perhaps help?
Sorry, no, I have no idea. Sorry.
I cannot hear you very well.
Oh, sorry, I have no idea. Sorry.
I have no idea. Then, Katarina, can you help? Katarina, for instance, a word like Dutch, my mother tongue, bier in Dutch, has been borrowed from Dutch into Japanese. In Japanese as bier. We know that this is a borrowing from Dutch and not from any other German, not from any other language like German, for instance, because it happened as early as 1724. We find this word in sources in 1724, and that is long before the first German contacts with Japanese. So the Dutch were the first to be on Japan after the Portuguese, but the Portuguese were kicked out because they were Catholic. The Dutch were Protestant and they were tolerated in Japan starting from the 17th century. And these first contacts with Europe caused a lot of borrowing and a lot of vocabulary was borrowed from Dutch into Japanese. And this word for beer is one of the words that was borrowed. On the other hand, words can also be inherited from a common ancestor. If we see a similarity between beer in English and beer in German and beer in Dutch, it does not imply that these words have been borrowed from one language into to the other. No, these words are similar because they all go back to one common ancestor, one ancestral word that we can reconstruct, although it has never been written down. Comparing these words and unwinding the sound correspondences leads to the reconstruction of a Proto Germanic word, which we can reconstruct as boira, beer. So here we know that the words look alike because they have been borrowed, because they have been inherited from a common ancestor, while Japanese beer and Dutch beer look alike because they have been borrowed from one language into the other. So that's the difference between borrowing and inheritance. Now, going to the history of the Trans-Eurasian debate actually brings us back to the history of historical comparative linguistics, the beginnings of historical comparative linguistics. And it is standard in the field of historical comparative linguistics to say that it all started with Sir William Jones in the 18th century. Sir William Jones gave a talk at the Royal Society of Bengalan in India, where he gave the following speech. And maybe Nadine Pracht, can you read this citation here?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, it is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. Yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong, indeed, that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Yes, indeed, here Sir William Jones brings up the idea that the correspondences or the similarities between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek are uh, are so rich that they can hardly be coincidental. So he says these languages look alike, probably because they sprung from some common source, because they descended from a common ancestral language, which linguists now tend to call Proto-Indo-European. This this quote from Sir William Jones is normally taken as the beginning of historical comparative linguistics, the beginning of the idea that languages can descend from one common source. However, the idea was circulating already quite some time, much earlier already in the 17th century. The Khan of Kiva, Abu al-Ghazi, already wrote a book on the genealogy of the Tatars and the genealogy of the Turks, proposing that the language of the Turkic speakers, the Turkic languages, were related to Mongol Manchu and Tungusic. And he also added Finno-Ugric, Samoyedic, and the languages of the Caucasus uh, in the picture. So he proposed one big, large family in Central Asia that comprised all these languages, and that was more than 100 years before Sir William Jones. So this idea of language relatedness was already circulating much longer in the literature. And the idea, this book was sold in Siberia. It was sold to Swedish people who were uh, taken captive by the Russians in Siberia, and these Swedish people brought the book to Europe, and like that, it became published in French in Leiden by Brill, and there the Dutch mayor Nicolaas Witsen wrote a boek on Tartarije, landen en volken, Noord- en Oostelijke gedeelten van Azië en Europa. And there already he proposed the same idea as Abu al-Ghazi, the same idea that these Altaic languages, these Trans-Eurasian languages, were related to some other languages in North Asia. And so he mooted the contours of the Altaic language family. And the idea was also repeated or recapitulated by the Swedish officer Philip Johan Tabert von Stralenberg in the 18th century. And he called this family the Tatar family. So, although this family was still bigger than our family, as it also included Finno-Ugric, Samoyedic, and the languages of the Caucasus, it was already the first idea about Altaic. But the term Altaic was not used yet. They called it Tatar. The first person to add Japanese to this family was a German person, namely Dr. von Zibolt, Philipp Franz Balthasar von Zibolt. He was a German physician and a botanist who worked for the East Indies Company, and who was dispatched to Japan. He was basically German, but he worked for a Dutch company, and he spoke fluently Dutch. And he also wrote een verhandeling over de afkomst der Japanners, a thesis on the origins of the Japanese in Dutch. And therefore, the first time he proposed that Japanese was related to this Tartar family. Here on the slides, you see Philip von Zibolt with his family. He married in Japan with a Japanese woman, so probably it was the first European Japanese marriage ever. And he had a little daughter with her. You see here on the slide, you see this little red-haired girl in a kimono. That was his daughter, and she became the first doctor in Japan. So she learned botany from her father, and became a physician just like him. Uh, Unfortunately, von Zibolt had to leave Japan because he stole some maps of Japan, and that was not very strategic. The shogun did not want foreigners to have maps of Japan, so they sent him back to Holland, where he was the first head of the Japanese language department in Leiden. So it's the same department where I worked centuries later. And in Leiden, there is still this von Zibolt Museum. If you ever visit Leiden, I would certainly advise to go there. It's a very nice museum that is built around the discoveries of von Zibolt. But von Zibolt was also the first person who proposed that Japanese belonged to these Tatar languages. And then the first person to use the term Altaic as such was a Finnish ethnologist and philologist, Matthias Alexander Castrain. He used the term Altaic not in reference to not only what we call Altaic today, so not only Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, but he still left Finno-Ugric and Samoyedic, so the Uralic languages in the picture. So he used Altaic for what we today designate as Ural Altaic. And here you see that was already noticed, I think, by Julia Ledig, that the name of Altai goes back to this mountain chain, the Altai Mountains in Central Asia. So that's the reason for coining it. But as soon as this big language family took shape, there were also people that went in the attack that thought that these languages were not related. And like that, there was a French sinologist and a medical doctor, JeanPierre Abell Rémusat, who also correctly observed that the similarities between the Mongolic and the Turkic and the Tungusic languages were often restricted to cultural vocabulary, general cultural words, and that they were not in the basic vocabulary, not words like eat, drink, live, nose, hair, that are very common and non-cultural. He said, les mots de ces langages, particulièrement ceux qui désignent des objets de première nécessité, sont radicalement différents. So the basic vocabulary, les mots de première nécessité, of the first necessity, expressing very basic things, they are very different. It's only cultural words that are similar, and that's why he didn't accept this theory. He thought, like many people today, that all the similarities across the Trans-Eurasian languages were borrowed and that they did not go back to a common ancestral language. A man that is usually seen as the pioneer of Altaic linguistics is Gustav John Ramstadt. He is the so-called founder of Altaic. He's the first one who proposed MacroAltaic, so the smaller family of Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic. So he got rid of the Uralic languages and said, no, there is this core of Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic languages that are related. And he was also the first to apply the modern historical comparative linguistic method to these languages. And posthumously, as you can see, he died in 1950. But in 1952, his Einführung in die Altaische Sprachwissenschaft, Formenlehre, and in 1957, his Einführung in die Lautlehre were published. I have here a book. It's a quite recent book that appeared some years ago. It's about the life of Ramstadt, an interesting book. And last year there was a girl who did her presentation on the life of Gustav Ramstadt. So usually people would read like 3 articles and then base their presentation upon these articles. But she chose to read only this one book. But the presentation was very nice and also nicely illustrated. So in this second line of development, where we have a more core Altaic or a MacroAltaic, we also see Nicholas Poppe. Nicholas Poppe is a famous Altaicist. He was Russian, then worked in Germany, in Berlin, and in the war he then escaped to the United States. And he wrote a book, Introduction to Altaic Linguistics, which has long been like the standard comparative grammar for Altaic, because there was, for a long time, there was not so much more than this book. He also published in German eine vergleichende Grammatik der altaischen Sprachen. You will see that very often, even if the authors are Finnish or Russian or Japanese even, they write in German, because Germany was really one of the key countries promoting this historical comparative linguistic study of the Trans-Eurasian languages. Oh, I forgot to tell you, the person here next to Poppe, that is Lars Johansson, and Lars Johansson is still living in Mainz today. He's retired, but he used to be the chair of the Seminar für Turkologie here in Mainz, and also a big supporter of Trans-Eurasian historical comparative linguistics. Murayama Shichiro then is a Japanese scholar who studied in the war with Altaic linguistics from Nicholas Poppe in Berlin. It is often said that Murayama Shichiro was a spy for the Japanese. I don't know whether that is true or not, but he did some very good work on Japanese. He wrote a book on the origins of the Japanese language, also proposing that Japanese was related to Altaic, and he also published in German Altaische Komponente der japanischen Sprache. But even if this Altaic idea became more linguistically orthodox and better supported by comparative methodology, there were still people who doubted the relatedness of the Trans-Eurasian languages. And maybe Kevin Neidhofer can read this citation for us. Kevin, are you there?
Yes.
Yes.
So from Clausen 1962?
Yes.
Clausen 62, 12. As a young man, I had always accepted the theory that the Turkish and Mongolian languages were genetically related. It seemed prime facie probable, but I was not greatly moved by the subject. It was Turkish and not Mongolian that, that interested me. but I did accept it. And so, when a Romanized text of the secret history of the Mongols, a work that I did expect to interest me, became available, I tried to read it. I did not begin to understand it, and I could find nothing Turkish about the language in which it was written. And so I came to the conclusion that the theory that the Turkish and the Mongolian languages were genetically related, the Altaic theory, was almost certainly wrong.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So you see that actually the idea of Professor Clausen was rather naive. His idea was like, well, I know Turkish very well. And when I read a Mongolian text, I didn't understood a thing about it. So probably Turkish and Mongolian are not related. That's a bit like saying, when I read a Russian text and I'm a native speaker of Dutch and I don't understand the Russian text, then probably Russian and Dutch are not related, although we know that these languages, the Slavic languages and the Germanic languages, are related within the context of the Indo-European family. So the arguments were a bit naive, and he's often cited by or by pro-Altaicists to show how naive the arguments really were. But on the other hand, one must say he had also more advanced and more valuable counter arguments. One of the things he also said is that there was no basic vocabulary shared by the Trans-Eurasian languages, and that the words they shared all related to cultural vocabulary, like pastoral vocabulary, and that showed that similarities were due to borrowing rather than to inheritance. Another very fervent opponent of the idea that the Trans-Eurasian languages were related is Gerard Durfur. He wrote a very big magistral work, which was his habilitation, and that was a work called Türkische und Mongolische Elemente im Neupersischen. Although it's dealing with borrowings from Turkic and Mongolic in Iranian, it shows that many of the words that were thought to be related between Turkic and Mongolic are really borrowings. So he's a critic, and he's right in many of the things he says. He's right that many of these words are borrowing, but the small core of words that he cannot explain as borrowing, he just says of these words, oh, they are zufall. But I think that zufall in Durfur's terms is often a synonym of cognate. So that it's exactly the small core of evidence that he cannot explain. That exactly is what underlies the Altaic family or the Trans-Eurasian family. And as we already said, Germany played a key role in Trans-Eurasian studies, and not only Germany, but Mainz in particular. It was here in Mainz that the first annual meeting of the Permanent International Altaistic Conference took place in the 60s. This conference has nowadays diluted in a kind of club of people who like all aspects of Central Asia. But when it started, it was really a group of scholars that were interested in the linguistics of the Trans-Eurasian languages. And the first meeting was started by Gerard Durfur. And Gerard Durfur at that time was working in Mainz as a research assistant, and he was also preparing his Habil-schrift here in Mainz. Later then, he moved to Göttingen, where he became a professor. He once returned to Mainz in 1994. But by then, we had a new chair here at a Seminar für Orientkunde, namely Johannes Benzing. He became a full professor here in Mainz. He was also a critic of the relatedness of Trans-Eurasian, but he was much more open for relatedness than Gerard Durfur. I think I have a little book here, yeah. Einführung in das Studium der altaischen Philologie. That's a book by Benzing of 1953, and then he has also his Kritische Beiträge zur Altaistik und Türkologie. So he was also very active in Altaic studies. And then more recently, we have already shown Lars Johansson when he was younger, when he met Poppe. Lars Johansson followed Johannes Benzing as the head of the Seminar for Orientkunde in Mainz. And together with his wife Eva Chato, who is also a Turkologist, they published a whole series, Turkic Languages, which is a journal series published with Harasowitz in Wiesbaden, and very open to general questions in Trans-Eurasian. So not only about Turkic linguistics, but also broader Trans-Eurasian comparative linguistics. And Lars Johansson, who really inspired me and who also really pushed me in my career, he has retired. He's still alive. He lives in Bretzenheim, but there are still Mainzer forces in Trans-Eurasian studies today, as you can see, and you might know some of these people. We have Julian Rentsch, who is the head of the Seminar für Orient. Now it has changed. I think they merged with Slavic studies, but he's the head for Turkology in any case, and he has also some access to Mongolic languages. Then we have Andrei Malchukov, whom you might know, and who is a specialist in Tungusic languages, the Northern Tungusic language Even in particular. Then we have a doctoral researcher with a strong interest in Korean, who intended to give a Korean course last year, but I think due to Corona it was cancelled. Maybe he will give it again this year. And then, of course, there's Walter Bisang, who is a specialist in East Asian and Southeast Asian languages, and who is also supervising this Japanese department, or the Schwerpunkt Japanologie with linguistics. So I was just wondering whether you knew these people, or whether you have followed a course with any of these instructors. I will start the poll so that you can let me know whether you follow the course with one of them or not. So here are the results. 67% of the people, so 2/3, have been in a course with them, and the others not. That's interesting to know. And then we can move from the second line of development, the MacroAltaic family, so Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic, to the wider MacroAltaic family. That is an idea that revived in the 70s, also with the addition of Japanese and Korean to MacroAltaic. So instead of looking at the languages more to the west, like the Caucasian languages or the Uralic languages, people became aware of the fact that they had to look into the east, to Korean and Japanese. And one person who did a lot, especially for the comparative study between Japanese and Korean, was Sam Martin. In one of his books on Altaic, he wrote, "This year there will be no Nobel Prize in comparative Altaic." He was a very modest person, but he has done, Nadine, hi. But he has done he has done important things for the comparison of Japanese and Korean. Similarly, also Bruno Levin, a German professor who investigated especially the relationship between Japanese and Korean. Bruno Levin Levin proposed that Japanese and Ryukyuan were related to Koguryo, a language once spoken in the north of Korea, and that there was a second branch to which Korean belonged with the Southern Korean languages. And this is an idea which is still very acceptable today. Then there was one man who was quite famous, Roy Andrew Miller, especially because of his very polemic style. He wrote his book Japanese and the Other Altaic Languages. His books really read like novels, but the problem is a bit that there is, say, 10% facts and the rest is fiction. So there's a lot of speculating and he gives you a hard time actually to find the real good core etymologies. And then more recently in 2003, a Russian team headed by Sergey Starostin published this etymological dictionary of the Altaic languages. It is a very big 4-volume dictionary, and it can also be accessed over the internet. And here we find many, many etymologies, over 2,000 etymologies, most of them including, I think 1,800 of them include Japanese words and relate them to Trans-Eurasian. The problem with this is that it is more a big collection of lookalikes than it is really a good collection of sound etymologies. So one of the things I did in my doctoral dissertation in 2005 was to sift these etymologies and to look at the core of valuable material. So personally, I think that 70 to 80% of Starostin etymologies are not valid, while 20 to 30% are really core etymologies. And then we have a person who tends to be a bit versatile. He did a lot of good work in the history of Japanese. He wrote a Middle Japanese grammar and a Old Japanese grammar. And initially, in the beginning of his career, he thought that Japanese was indeed related to the Trans-Eurasian languages. But by 2000, he changed his opinion 100%, 180 degrees to the other side. And now he's a very fervent critic of the idea that Japanese and the Trans-Eurasian languages are related. So that is the Russian scholar Alexander Vovin, who currently who then worked at the university in Hawaii and who currently works in Paris. So just summarizing, we see it's almost like we see the corona figures here. It's going up and down and up and down. So we see this move in the ideas, the pro and anti movement about Trans-Eurasian relatedness, starting with the idea of a big family, a big Tatar family, not only including Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic, but also other languages of Central Asia, and then being countered by people like Abel Remusat, then again proposing a smaller core and using more linguistically orthodox means like the theories of Ramstadt and Poppe, the MacroAltaic movement. And then again, this is countered by people like Clausen and Durfur, to again move up by people like Roy Andrew Miller, adding Japanese and Korean to the picture. And then again, these theories are countered by Vovin. And then again, new people stand up like Starostin with his etymological dictionary, and perhaps also our Trans-Eurasian movement that try to give a more balanced idea about Trans-Eurasian, allowing for both inheritance and borrowing, so for both sides of the picture. So this is also a bit what was in the reading you probably did. The reading by Starostin George. George Starostin is the son of Sergey Starostin. So Sergey died in 2005, and his son, who is mainly in Khoisan African linguistics, uh, continued, but he also wrote a small contribution to the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Linguistics about Altaic languages. And that is the little article that I included as a reading. Uh, can you, maybe we can do a poll, can you do A when you read it and B when you didn't? Okay, I will publish the polling results. It seems as if we have a bit of a 50-50 division, a bit more people who read it than not. Is the problem if you didn't read it, could you access the article on the website, or what was the problem? Maybe you can write that to me in the chat. I actually read it. Okay, some people said no, but they read it. So in this article, maybe we can go now to to Ramon. Ramon, can you tell us which label does George Starostin use in reference to Trans-Eurasian? He does not use the name Trans-Eurasian, but which name does he use?
I'm sorry I didn't read the text, the article, I forgot about it.
Yes, but you can even see it in the title. What label does he use for Trans-Eurasian?
Altaic.
Altaic, indeed,
Yeah.
right. And then we can move on to Daniela Zibolt. Daniela, can you explain us what this proto, like in Proto-Altaic and Proto-Trans-Eurasian, what does that mean?
As far as I understand it, it means I don't know how to say it in English. Die Ursprungssprache, so the very first part of this family, the grandmother also.
Exactly. That's completely correct. So it's the Ursprache, the great 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 grandmother of the languages, the ancestral language, or the common ancestor of the languages. So the idea that all these languages sprung from one common source, to put it in the words of Sir William Jones. So this proto is always added to a language family to designate the one ancestral language underlying this family. So if we speak of Indo-European languages, we speak of 450 different languages. But if we speak of Proto-Indo-European, we speak of only one language, namely the reconstructed ancestral language underlying all Indo-European languages. And the same is true for Trans-Eurasian. When we speak of Trans-Eurasian languages, we mean Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, Turkic. But if we speak of Proto-Trans-Eurasian, we mean only one language, namely a language that has never been written down, but that can be reconstructed using linguistic means, and that was probably spoken, say, in 6000 BC or earlier. So this one original ancestral language. In the article by Starostin, he also mentions not proto, but pro-Altaicists, and anti-Altaicists. So pro. Can you explain what he means by that? Perhaps Nadine Pracht, can you explain what are pro-Altaicists and anti-Altaicists?
Well, I think the pro-Altaists are those scientists who think there is an familiar connection between these languages, and the anti-Altaists are think there is no connection.
Exactly, that's it. And then, Elias, do you know the main objections? Can you give us maybe one or two objections against the relatedness of the Trans-Eurasian languages in general, and the relatedness between Japanese and Trans-Eurasian in particular?
One of them is, as you've already said, there's not really a basic lexicon that they share. Then there are some issues with grammar that can't really be traced back in any kind of conclusive manner. And then there's also phonetics that
Exactly.
kind of don't add up when you reconstruct it all.
Yeah. I think, thank you, Elias. I think that you really mentioned the three core objections. One thing, as we already mentioned, is the basic vocabulary. The idea that these languages have similarities, but all these similarities seem to be cultural words, and there is no basic vocabulary shared. The second one, also mentioned by Elias, is the phonological objection, namely that we cannot establish regular sound correspondences between these languages, that they look alike but without real regular correspondences. And then there's what Elias called a grammatical objection, namely the lack of common morphology, namely that the little building stones of the words that are very telling when it comes to language relatedness, that these little building stones don't match. And then another point that was already mentioned earlier by Nadine in this pro-anti debate. So the fact that people think that many of the correspondences are borrowed rather than inherited, so that the similarities are not borrowing proof, that they are probably rather borrowed than inherited. That are indeed the four main objections. And we must say that every single of these objections makes sense. It's not as if the people telling that are like complete morons. They have a point. In my previous research, I have argued that indeed many of these of the similarities between the Trans-Eurasian languages are questionable, but that it is nevertheless possible to find a core of evidence, a core of reliable evidence that supports the common ancestorship of the Trans-Eurasian languages. And I have worked on the evidence from different perspectives. In 2005, I wrote my doctoral dissertation in 2003 actually, but it was published as a book. This side in 2005. That was dealing with vocabulary. And then I wrote another book, Diachrony of Verb Morphology, here in 2015, that was dealing then with the morphological question. And then we have some, then there is this general reference work on the history of the debate, Trans-Eurasian Linguistics in 2017 with Routledge. And then there's a more general reference work, which I already showed to you, Trans-Eurasian Languages, that shows that indeed a lot of similarities are due to borrowing, but that there is nevertheless a small core of evidence. So that is how I see the matter in large. Of course, my ideas were not always received as enthusiastically. Some people were very positive about my research and the research also of my team and other people on this topic. I got, I think, 14 reviews of my books so far, and some people are really convinced. Like, for instance, Eliasson 2016, who thinks that that there are conceivable genealogical links between the language groups in question. Then we have Bernard Comrie, who used to be the head of the Max Planck Institute for in Leipzig, the typology department, and he thought that it was the most convincing demonstration to date of the unity of the Altaic family. And then we have Ditchy in 2007 for a proof for a close genetic relationship between Japanese and Altaic. Rodziki is already a bit milder, an outstanding contribution to scholarship and a superb example of disciplined methodology. And Ross, her methodology seems beyond rebuke. And then we have people who are a bit in the middle, a kind of maybe. This yes should rather be maybe or perhaps, even if there are a few thought provoking resemblances. But then we go to the very negative point of views. Georg, for instance, says cross out yes and insert in boldface no. And then we have people like Sasha Woven, whom we discussed as a specialist in Japanese, in Old Japanese. He thinks that my research is scholarly wise, completely useless, but it will hold your stacks of paper very well. So at least one good point about this book is its volume, so it will hold your papers very well. So as you can see, the ideas are very different, going from a hot yes, a very enthusiastic yes, to very cold no. And in what is coming in the class that is coming, I will try to show where this evidence and counter evidence, where these attitudes really come from, in an as neutral way as possible. I think I will have to upload the next slides. We still have about 30 minutes to go. So get a drink. I will just upload it for a minute or so, and then we will continue. So here I'm back again. We will continue now with the family of Japanese. So I would like to introduce you to the Japanese language and its history, and then in the next class we will continue with Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic languages. So just a short overview on the Japanese language. The family of Japanese. So we will be dealing with the periodization of Japanese, how Japanese developed over time. Then also the classification, how people have proposed to classify the Japonic languages, because there's not only Japanese, but there are several Japonic languages. And then we will say a few words on language diversity in Japan, and then we will have a quick bird's eye view of the structure of Japanese. First, the periodization. So the periodization of Japanese. There's this nice book on the history of Japanese. It's a book by Bjarke Frellesvik that came out, I think, in 2011. The history of the Japanese language. That is actually the part of the history of the Japanese language that follows after this course. So we try to go back in prehistory of Japanese, relating it to other languages, and our history stops, so to say, when written history begins. And this history describes the whole period of the written history of Japanese. So from the first written sources of Japanese until today. And the first written sources of Japanese are called Old Japanese. They go back to the period of the 8th and 9th century. In Japan, this is also called Jodai Nihongo or Joko Nihongo, so Old Japanese. And it goes back to the Nara time. That is the period where the capital of Japan was still in the city of Nara. It had not moved to Kyoto yet, so that's where the emperor was living. It is a time where the influence of Chinese on Japanese is still very low. So when you study Japanese, you have all these Chinese loanwords in Japanese, but those came in later. So they came in during Heian times. Rather in late Middle Japanese than in early Middle Japanese even. So in early Middle Japanese is the period from the 9th to the 13th century. It's the time when the court had moved to Kyoto, the Heian times, and there we find a rich literature written in early Middle Japanese. Late Middle Japanese then is the period until 1600. It's the period of the Kamakura and Muromachi periods in Japanese history. And we speak of modern Japanese then starting in the Edo period. The Edo period is when the capital of Japan moves to Tokyo, and when the shogun becomes a more important person than the emperor. In the Edo and Meiji time, we speak of modern Japanese. So that is also the time of the Rangaku, the borrowings of Dutch, which we mentioned today, also the period where Japanese has its first contacts with Western languages. Note that this topic of contact with Western languages, contact with Spanish, with Portuguese, Dutch, and German, could also be a topic for your presentations. And then we speak of contemporary Japanese, which is the Japanese that as we know it today, starting from 1900, so in the Taisho, Showa, and Heisei times. Early sources of Japanese, the very early sources of Japanese are early inscriptions, so that are inscriptions on swords and mirrors and stones, like the Inariyama tumulus sword inscription, and also mokkan, wooden tablets that were attached to houses, saying, for instance, this is a bakery or this is a rice cellar. But it's only in the 8th century that we really see a monumental literature of old Japanese coming up. So in the 8th century, we see a whole lot of books appearing. The Kojiki, the Nihonshiki, the Manyoshu, a big collection of poems, the Norito, the Semmyo, and the Fudoki, all different sources in old Japanese. So the first written records of Japanese. Here is this Inariyama sword. It was a sword that was found in the 70s, but only in the late 70s, it was discovered that it has an inscription of 115 Chinese characters. These Chinese characters are not used to represent Chinese, but they are used to write Japanese. They include 46 phonograms that represent Japanese language, although written with Chinese characters. And here you see some examples of the so-called mokkan and other wooden tablets and daggers and tiles where people also find inscriptions on. From the periodization of Japanese, we move to the classification of Japanese. As we already noticed, Japanese may seem like a single language, but there's a whole family of Japonic languages that can be classified in a certain way. So we think that the old Japanese languages go back to Proto-Japonic, which is a language that was spoken around 300 BC and split into two branches, a mainland Japanese branch and a Kyushu branch. Yeah, is there a question? No. The Kyushu branch, Japan came probably in from the Korean Peninsula. It arrived on the island of Kyushu in the south of Japan, and there it split into a mainland branch that went upwards on the main island, and a Kyushu branch that remained for a while on Kyushu. On the mainland, we got Proto-Japanese that divided into Eastern Old Japanese and Central Old Japanese. Central Old Japanese is the language that is attested in most old written sources of Japanese. There are only very few sources that preserve some Eastern Old Japanese, like, for instance, this Fudoki. And today, all languages and all dialects of Japanese go back to Central Old Japanese. There's only one dialect on an island in the Bay of Tokyo, the Hachijo dialect, that goes back to Eastern Old Japanese. So Eastern Old Japanese has died out practically completely, while Central Old Japanese still lives further in present-day Japanese. And then on Kyushu, we had this branch of languages that only later went from Kyushu to the Ryukyus, probably around 900 AD, when agriculture moved from Kyushu to the Ryukyus. These farming people also took their language with them, and then we get these Ryukyuan languages arriving in the Ryukyuan Islands. So we have a branch of northern Ryukyuan languages, Amami and Okinawa, and we have a branch of southern Ryukyuan languages, Miyako, Yayama, and Yonaguni. So we can say that there are at least 6 different Japonic languages, whereby the Hachijo dialect can be seen as a dialect of Japanese. These other languages, Amami, Okinawa, Miyako, Yayama, and Yonaguni, are really 5 different languages. You could compare the difference a bit between German and Dutch, or between Spanish and French. So the difference between the Romance languages or the Germanic languages. However, the most standard idea is this idea, what I also just proposed, whereby you have a split in Proto-Japonic between mainland Japanese and Ryukyuan. There are also other ideas. Elisabeth de Boer, for instance, in this book on Trans-Eurasian languages, proposes another tree for Japonic, whereby it would have split in 4 branches: Eastern Old Japanese, Central Old Japanese, an Izumo Tohoku branch, and a Kyushu Ryukyu branch. That's also an interesting idea, and if you want to know more about it, you could check her article, and eventually you could present something on the classification of Japanese as your final presentation. linguistic diversity of Japan. When we speak of Japan, we often think of one language, Japanese, but so far it's clear that there's not only Japanese spoken by this girl, which the daughter of my friend in Japan, Ha-chan. She's now already a big lady, but she speaks standard Japanese. But then we have also the languages spoken on the Ryukyus, the 5 different Japonic languages spoken on the Ryukyus. But then in addition to that, there's another language which was once spoken in Japan that is completely unrelated to Japonic, that has nothing to do with Ryukyuan languages or Japanese as such, and that is Ainu, the language of northern Japan, the language of Hokkaido. So here you see Hokkaido in the north. Here you see Honshu, or the main island. This little island here in the south of Honshu, that is Kyushu. That is where Japanese arrived from the Korean peninsula. And then we have the Ryukyu Islands. Now here is Taiwan, but just so far as Taiwan. We have the Ryukyu Islands where people speak this Ryukyuan languages. Here you see Amami and Okinawa, Miyako, Yayama, and then you have also Yonaguni, who should be here, that are all different Japonic languages. Here you see the classification of the Ryukyuan languages. Ryukyuan languages split into northern and southern Ryukyuan, and the southern Ryukyuan split into Miyako, Yayama, and Yonaguni, while the northern Ryukyuan languages consist of the Okinawa and the Amami languages. But then there's, of course, also Ainu, the language of the people in North Japan and in Tohoku, the northern part of the main island. These people are often designated as Ainu. Ainu is a name for self-reference. In Ainu, Ainu means person. But sometimes in Japanese sources, we also find the use of the term emishi, the people of northeast Japan. This is also derived from an Ainu word, namely enchu, also person. And then in the Shokunihongi, in the old, in a source from old Japanese, we find the term kebito, hairy people. It's obvious why they call the Ainu kebito, in contrast to the more to the Japanese, who are a bit of Asian morphology. These Ainu people are more hairy, they have beards and curly hair, they are a bit more robust, shorter, stronger. So they are a different morphological type than the Japanese. Of course, over the years, the Ainu and the Japanese mixed, and today the people who live in northern Japan and on Hokkaido look like standard Japanese people. You do not see much difference. So here you see the distribution of Ainu. Ainu used to be spoken not only on Hokkaido, where in South Hokkaido the last native speakers have now vanished a few years ago. It was also spoken until the mid-18th century in North Honshu. There are many place names here in North Honshu, these red dots, that are still Ainu place names, showing that Ainu used to be spoken there. Then you have also on the Kuril Islands until the beginning of the 20th century, there was Ainu spoken there. And then probably also on the south of Kamchatka and here in Sakhalin. But after the war, many of these people were deported and they were moved back to Hokkaido. And nowadays, there's no more Ainu on the Kurils or on Kamchatka or in Sakhalin. In Hokkaido there was Ainu, but now the language got extinct. There's this Ainu revival movement that we already mentioned, whereby they train Ainu teachers, they give language courses, there's Ainu on the radio, there's an Ainu speech contest, and there's a newspaper, the Ainu Times, but nevertheless there are no native Ainu speakers left, so all are secondary speakers. If we look at some concepts or some items of basic vocabulary, words for fire, nose, go, water, and mouth, we see that Japanese and the Ryukyuan languages are close to one another. We can still discover common roots. But on the other hand, we see that Ainu is completely different. So, for instance, the word for fire in Japanese is hi, and that derives from an old Japanese word pi. Uh, in some Ryukyuan languages, like Amami, you have a completely different root. Like here, matsu in Amami, probably the same root as umachi in Miyako. But in Okinawa, you have hui, which is the same root as Japanese hi and Old Japanese pi. You have yayama pi, which also developed from that root and still reflects the Old Japanese pi, so very conservative. And then you have Yonaguni chi, which is also probably related. But then in Ainu, you get a very different word. You get ape, a word that cannot be related through sound correspondences. And the same is true with hana. Again, you have this regular correspondence between Japanese, modern Japanese hana, and old Japanese pana for nose. And then you see this ha and pi reflected in the Ryukyuan languages with very similar forms. In Yonaguni, you have something as hana buru, buru meaning something like what points out, and then a very different word in Ainu, etu. And that is also true for the stem for go. Similar roots across Japanese and Ryukyuan languages, but totally different roots in Ainu, Oman, and Paye. And for mizu, water, the most of the words resemble each other closely in Japanese and Ryukyuan, but in Ainu you get waka, a totally different form. Think, for instance, of Wakanai, which is a city in the north of Japan, in the north of Hokkaido, that includes this Ainu component, waka, for water. And then also for kuchi, mouth, you have related roots across Japanese and the other Ryukyuan languages, and a completely different word in Ainu, paroho. So here you can see how close the different Japonic languages are to each other, a bit like Romance and Germanic, and how different Ainu is. Ainu is probably genealogically not related to Japanese. Then the general structure. We say of Japanese that it has an agglutinative structure. That means that it glues different morphemes together in a row. That word comes from the Latin verb agglutinare, glue together. So an agglutinative language is a language where there is a one-on-one relation between a morpheme and its meaning, and whereby the morphemes are arranged linearly in a row. So that's why in Japanese you can get these very long morpheme strings, all suffixes attached to one another. You have things like tatase raremashita. So, like in gakusei ga sensei ni tatasa raremashita. The student was made to stand up by the teacher. So gakusei ga, that's student in the nominative, sensei ni, teacher in the dative, and then you have tat, the root for stand up. Ase is a causative marker, rare is a passive marker, mash is a politeness marker, and dista is a marker for the past. So all these markers come together in a row linearly. They are glued together to make words. So that's what we mean by an agglutinative language. We were speaking today about an isolating language. That's the other principle. There you have independent function words. So one morpheme is one word, and the morphemes are not glued together in this way. Another characteristic of Japanese structure, morphological structure, is that it is dependent marking. In Japanese, for instance, you mark uh, possession on the possessor, on the dependent. So if you say in Japanese your head, you say anata no atama. So anata is you, no is the genitive marker, the possession marker, and atama is head. So the head of you. And this of, this genitive, is marked on you, not on the main word, not on the head, but on the you. So it's marked on the dependent. That's why we say this is dependent marking. The genitive is marked on the dependent. While in Ainu, you have, for instance, echi, shiki, hi, where the echi is the second plural, the shiki is I, and the hi is the genitive. You eyes thereof. So all the possession is marked on the main word. It's marked on the head, on the possessed. And that's a big difference. And Joanna Nichols even thinks that if there is such a sharp contrast with respect to head and dependent morphological marking between a particular language and the language within a proposed language family, this can be taken as negative evidence for the assumed genetic relationship. So, according to the typologist Joanna Nichols, this kind of difference in marking, dependent marking versus head marking, shows that Ainu and Japanese are probably not related. So, they go not back to an earlier ancestor. And then the syntactic structure of Japanese, the syntax is SOV, which means subject, object, verb. You have, for instance, English is mainly SVO. The cat eats fish. Cat is the subject, eat is the verb, or the object is fish. While in Japanese, you have SOV, neko ga, the cat, sakana o, the fish, taberu, eat. So the verb comes in the end. Such languages that are SOV are often automatically also more prone to use postpositions. In Japanese, you put the postposition de after the uchi, house. So if you will want to say in the house, you say uchi de. The postposition comes after uchi. And also you automatically you have the possessor followed by the possession, like in neko no sakana. In English, it's the other way around. You have prepositions in the house, and you will have the possession fish first, and the cat, the possessor, next, the fish of the cat. And then these languages, SVO languages, by implicational tendency, also tend to be auxiliary first, lexical verb next. So the cat is going to eat, is going to is an auxiliary, and the lexical verb is to eat. While in Japanese, which is an SOV language, the implicational tendency is the other way around. So there you have neko ga tabete kita. The cat, neko ga, tabete, eat, the lexical verb kita, came. The cat has just eaten, he came to eat. So the auxiliary stands last. It is so if you have SVO or SOV, the implicational tendencies are mostly the same in the languages across the world. Ainu, however, is a language like Japanese from the syntactic viewpoint, so it has also an SOV structure, but it does not use these particles to mark the function in the sentence, so it has not this ga subject particle or wo object particle. You need to know the function of the words from the place it takes in the sentence, like Ainu kamui raike. The Ainu is the person or the man, kamui the bear, raike killed. So there, the position is very important, because when you would turn it, you would get an entirely different meaning. Of course, you have also postpositions in Ainu. Chise ta, the house, in the house. You have possessor plus possession constructions. Sapo ninkari hi, the sister's earring, and you have verb plus auxiliary constructions, as in a o rusui. I want to eat. So syntactically, the structure is much like Japanese, but morphologically it's very different. And it's also in this different morphological structure that there might be a clue that Ainu is not genealogically related to Japanese. And then just to finish, a little wordplay that shows you how important these particles can be in Japanese. In spoken Japanese, the case suffixes or the case particles are often left out. So there is this little wordplay in modern Japanese. If you say pan tsukutta koto aru, what do you say? Do you say pan o tsukutta koto ga aru? That can be it, but it can also be pansu o kutta koto ga aru. What does pan o tsukutta koto ga aru mean? Joshua, did you do Japanese?
Ja, das heißt sowas wie, ich weiß, wie man Brot macht. So könnte
Yeah.
man. Oh, sorry. I know how to make bread. Sorry.
Yes,
Switched to Japanese.
almost. Koto ga aru is I have the experience of.
Oh, that
So
way, yeah.
I have the experience of making bread, or have you made bread? Have you the experience of making bread? And what is the other?
I have the experience of wearing pants.
Yeah, it's actually of eating. Ku is eating. Do you have you ever eaten pants? So it's a very different meaning, and it shows you how important these case particles really are in Japanese. So even if you have SOV, it's not enough. You really need case particles in Japanese to make the meaning clear. So I would like to thank you now and close with this final slide, and then we will see each other next time. Unless you have questions, then you can stay here until I will be here until 4 o'clock. So thank you very much for your attention. Bye.